Okay, Sunday morning. Let's get into it. My rebels with a cause. How are we going to escape the matrix? We're going to heal ourselves. If they have nothing to fuck with, the system collapses. Right? That's not a good theory. Okay, I did some pre-reading. I really like this chapter so far. It's not that long either, but it's pretty good, I think. Okay. Fat Boy's gonna say good morning. Aren't you? Stinky breath. My stinky breath puppy. My little stinky breath puppy. The soul of man. Okay, you need to stop. I'm gonna read here. Okay? I'm gonna wipe my glasses off. Hold on. Fat Boy. Stop, please. What we call civilized consciousness has steadily separated itself from the basic instincts. But these instincts have not disappeared. They have merely lost their contact with our consciousness and are thus forced to assert themselves in an indirect fashion. This may be by means of physical symptoms in the case of a neurosis, or by means of incidents of various kinds, like unaccountable moods, unexpected forgetfulness, or mistakes in speech. A man likes to believe that he is the master of his soul, but as long as he is unable to control his moods and emotions, or to be conscious of a myriad of secret ways in which unconscious factors insinuate themselves into his arrangements and decisions, he is certainly not his own master. I'm going to read that again. A man likes to believe he is the master of his soul, but as long as he is unable to control his moods and emotions, or to be conscious of the myriad secret ways in which unconscious factors insinuate themselves into his arrangements and decisions, he is certainly not his own master. These unconscious factors owe their existence to the autonomy of the archetypes. Modern man protects himself against seeing his own split state by a system of compartments. Certain areas of our outer life and of his own behavior are kept, as it were, in separate drawers and are never confronted with one another. As an example of this so-called compartment psychology, I remember the case of an alcoholic who had come under the laudable influence of a certain religious movement and, fascinated by its enthusiasm, had forgotten that he needed a drink. He was obviously and miraculously cured by Jesus, and he was correspondingly displayed as a witness to divine grace or to the efficiency of the said religious organization. But a few weeks of public confessions, the novelty began to pale, and some alcoholic refreshment seemed to be indicated, and so he drank again. But this time the helpful organization came to the conclusion that the case was pathological and obviously not suitable for intervention by Jesus. So they put him in a clinic to let the doctor do better than the divine healer. This is an aspect of the modern cultural mind that is worth looking into. it shows an alarming degree of disassociation and psychological confusion. If, for a moment, we regard mankind as one individual, we see that the human race is like a person carried away by unconscious powers, and that the human race also likes to keep certain problems tucked away in their separate drawers. But this is why we should give a great deal of consideration to what we are doing. For mankind is now threatened by self-created and deadly dangers that are growing beyond our control. And so this book was copywritten. I'm bringing this up because they're going to talk about what was going on during the period of time. Let's see, copyright in 1964. This is probably before that. Not Sigmund Freud. Carl Jung was referring to communism. He'll bring it up in a minute here. But this can apply to any of the political arenas that we're dealing with today. This is an aspect of the modern cultural mind that is worth looking into. It shows an alarming degree of disassociation and psychological confusion. If for a moment we regard mankind as one individual, we see that the human race is like a person carried away by unconscious powers, and the human race also likes to keep certain problems tucked away in separate drawers. But this is why we should give a great deal of consideration to what we are doing. For mankind is now threatened by self-created and deadly dangers that are growing beyond our control. Our world is, so to speak, disassociated, like a neurotic, with the Iron Curtain marking the symbolic line of division. Western man, becoming aware of the aggressive will to power of the East, sees himself forced to take extraordinary measures of defense, at the same time as he prides himself on his virtue and good intentions. What he fails to see is that his own vices, which he has covered up by good international manners, that are thrown back in his face by the communist world, shamelessly and methodically. What the West has tolerated, but secretly and with a slight sense of shame, the diplomatic lie, systematic deception, veiled threats, comes back into the open and in full measure from the East and ties us up in neurotic knots. It is the face of his own evil shadow that grins at Western man from the other side of the Iron Curtain. It is this state of affairs that explains the peculiar feeling of helplessness of so many people in Western societies. They have begun to realize that the difficulties confronting us are moral problems, and that the attempts to answer them by a policy of piling up nuclear arms or by economic competition is achieving very little, for it cuts both ways. Many of us now understand that moral and mental means would be more efficient, since they could provide us with psychic immunity against the ever-increasing infection. But all such attempts have proved singularly ineffective, and will continue to do so as long as we try to convince ourselves that the world that it is only they, our opponents, who are wrong. It would be much more to the point for us to make a serious attempt to recognize our own shadow and its nefarious doings. If we could see our shadow, the dark side of our nature, we should be immune to any moral and mental infection and insinuation. As matters now stand, we lay ourselves open to every infection, because we are really doing practically the same thing as they. Only we have the additional disadvantage that we neither see nor want to understand what we ourselves are doing under the cover of good manners. The communist world, it may be noted, has one big myth, which we call an illusion, in the vain hope that our superior judgment will make it disappear. It is the time-hollowed archetypical dream of a golden age or paradise, where everything is provided in abundance for everyone, and a great, just, and wise chief rules over a human kindergarten. This powerful archetype, in its infantile form, has gripped them, but it will never disappear from the world at the mere sight of our superior points of view. We even support it by our own childishness. For our Western civilization is in the grip of the same mythology. Unconsciously, we cherish the same prejudices, hopes, and expectations. We too believe in the welfare state, in universal peace, in the equality of man, in his eternal human rights, in justice, truth, and, do not say it too loudly, the kingdom of God on earth. The sad truth is that man's real life consists of a complex of inexorable opposites: day and night, birth and death, happiness and misery, good and evil. We are not even sure that one will prevail against the other, that good will overcome evil, or joy defeat pain. And even those words are like so perspective. Who's to say what good is and evil is anyway? I mean, some of it's pretty clear cut and dry, but others not so much. Life is a battleground. It always has been and always will be. And if it were not so, existence would come to an end. It was precisely this conflict within man that led the early Christians to accept and hope for an early end to this world. Or the Buddhists to reject all earthly desires and aspirations. These basic answers would be frankly suicidal if they were not linked up with the peculiar mental and moral ideas and practices that constitute the bulk of both religions, and that, to a certain extent, modify their radical denial of the world. I stress this point because in our time there are millions of people who have lost faith in any kind of religion. Such people do not understand their religion any longer. While life runs smoothly without religion, the loss remains as good as unnoticed. But when suffering comes, it is another matter. This is when people begin to seek a way out and to reflect about the meaning of life and its bewildering and painful experiences. Is it significant that the psychological doctor, within my experience, is consulted more by Jews and Protestants than by Catholics? This might be expected, for the Catholic Church still feels responsible for the cura animarum, the care of the soul's welfare. But in this scientific age, the psychiatrist is apt to be asked the questions that once belonged in the domain of the theologian. People feel that it makes or would make a great difference if only they had a positive belief in a meaningful way of life, or in God and immortality. The specter of approaching death often gives a powerful incentive to such thoughts. From time immemorial, men have ideas about a supreme being, one or several, and about the land of the hereafter. Only today do they think they can do without such ideas? Because we cannot discover God's throne in the sky with a radio telescope, or establish for certain that a beloved father or mother is still about in more or less corporeal form, people assume that such ideas are not true. I would rather say that they are not true enough, for these are conceptions of a kind that have accompanied human life from prehistoric times, and that still break through into consciousness at any provocation. Modern man may assert that he can dispense with them, and he may bolster his opinion by insisting that there is no scientific evidence of their truth, or he may even regret the loss of his convictions. But since we are dealing with invisible and unknowable things, for God is beyond human understanding, there is no means of proving immortality. Why should we bother about evidence? Even if we did not know by reason our need for salt in our food, we should nonetheless profit from its use. We might argue that the use of salt is a mere illusion of taste or a superstition, but it would still contribute to our well-being. Why, then, should we deprive ourselves of views that would prove helpful in crisis and would give a meaning to our existence? And how do we know that such ideas are not true? Fat boy, relax. Many people would agree with me if I stated flatly that such ideas are probably illusions. What they fail to realize is that the denial is as impossible to prove as the assertion of the religious belief. We are entirely free to choose which point of view we take. It will, in any case, be an arbitrary decision. There is, however, a strong empirical reason why we should cultivate thoughts that can never be proved. It is that they are known to be useful. Man positively needs general ideas and convictions that will give a meaning to his life and enable him to find a place for himself in the universe. He can stand the most incredible hardships when he is convinced that they make sense. He is crushed when, on top of all his misfortunes, he has to admit that he's taking part in a tale told by an idiot. It is the role of religious symbols to give a meaning to the life of man. The Pueblo people believe that they are the sons of Father Sun, and this belief endows their life with a perspective and a goal that goes far beyond their limited existence. It gives them ample space for the unfolding of personality and permits them a full life as complete persons. Their plight is infinitely more satisfactory than that of a man in our own civilization who knows that he is and will remain nothing more than an underdog with no inner meaning to his life. A sense of a wider meaning to one's existence is what raises a man beyond mere getting and spending. If he lacks this sense, he is lost and miserable. Had St. Paul been convinced that he was nothing more than a wandering weaver of carpets, he certainly would not have been the man he was. His real and meaningful life lay in the inner certainty that he was the messenger of the Lord. One may accuse him of suffering from megalomania, but this opinion pales before the testimony of history and the judgment of subsequent generations. The myth that took possession of him made him something greater than a mere craftsman. Such a myth, however, consists of symbols that have not been invented consciously. They have happened, It was not the man Jesus who created the myth of the God-man. It existed for many centuries before his birth. He himself was seized by the symbolic idea, which, as St. Mark tells us, lifted him out of the narrow life of the Nazarene carpenter. And then they show a picture. So the first picture that is shown is the Berlin Wall. And then they show a picture here. Every society has its idea of the archetypal paradise or golden age, that it is believed once existed and will exist again. A 19th century American painting embodies the idea of the past utopia. It shows William Penn's treaty in 1682 with the Native Americans occurring in an ideal setting where all is harmony and peace. That's the top picture here. And then down below, the Garden of Eden, depicted as a walled and womb-like garden in the 15th century French painting, and showing the expulsion of Adam and Eve. Myths go back to the primitive storyteller and his dreams, to men moved by the stirrings of their fantasies. These people were not very different from those whom later generations have called poets or philosophers. Primitive storytellers did not concern themselves with the origin of their fantasies. It was very much later that people began to wonder where a story originated. Yet centuries ago, in what we now call ancient Greece, men's minds were advanced enough to surmise that the tales of the gods were nothing but archaic and exaggerated traditions of long-buried kings or chieftains. Men already took the view that the myth was too improbable to mean what it said. They therefore tried to reduce it to a generally understandable form. In more recent times, we have seen the same thing happen with dream symbolism. We became aware in the years when psychology was in its infancy that dreams had some importance. But just as the Greeks persuaded themselves in their myths were merely elaborations of rational or normal history, so some of the pioneers of psychology came to the conclusion that dreams did not mean what they appeared to mean. The images or symbols that they presented were dismissed as bizarre forms in which repressed contents of the psyche appeared to the conscious mind. It thus came to be taken for granted that a dream meant something other than its obvious statement. I have already described my disagreement with this idea, a disagreement that led me to study the form as well as the content of dreams. Why should they mean something different from their contents? Is there anything in nature that is other than it is? The dream is a normal and natural phenomenon, and it does not mean something it is not. The Talmudides even says, the dream is its own interpretation. The confusion arises because the dream's contents are symbolic and thus have more than one meaning. The symbols point in different directions from those we apprehend with the conscious mind, and therefore they relate to something either unconscious or at least not entirely conscious. To the scientific mind, such phenomena as symbolic ideas are a nuance because they cannot be formulated. Nuisance or nuance? Nuisance. They are a nuisance because they cannot be formulated in a way that is satisfactory to the intellect and logic. They are by no means the only case of this kind in psychology. The trouble begins when the phenomenon of the effect or emotion which evades all the attempts of the psychologist to pin it down with final definition. The cause of the difficulty is the same in both cases: the intervention of the unconscious. The intervention of the unconscious. I know enough of the scientific point of view to understand that it is most annoying to have to deal with facts that cannot be completely or adequately grasped. The trouble with these phenomena is that the facts are undeniable and yet cannot be formulated into intellectual terms. For this one would have to be able to comprehend life itself. For it is life that produces emotions and symbolic ideas. The academic psychologist is perfectly free to dismiss the phenomenon of emotion or the concept of the unconscious, or both, from his consideration. Yet they remain facts to which the medical psychologist at least has to pay due attention. For emotional conflicts, an intervention of the unconscious are the classical features of his science. If he treats a patient at all, he comes up against these irrationalities as hard facts, irrespective of his ability to formulate them in intellectual terms. It is therefore quite natural that people who have not had the medical psychologist's experience find it difficult to follow what happens when psychology ceases to be a tranquil pursuit for the scientist in the laboratory and becomes an active part of the adventure of real life. Target practice on a shooting range is far from the battlefield. The doctor has to deal with casualties in a genuine war. He must concern himself with psychic realities, even if he cannot embody them in scientific definitions. That is why no textbooks can teach psychology. One learns only by actual experience. We can see this point clearly when we examine certain well-known symbols. The cross in Christian religion, for instance, is a meaningful symbol that expresses a multitude of aspects, ideas, and emotions. But a cross after a name on a list simply indicates the individual is dead. So it's also interesting because when I've just read that, what came to my mind, the cross in the Christian religion, for instance, is a meaningful symbol that expresses a multitude of aspects, ideas, and emotions. And for people who have been abused and terrorized by the church, sometimes it can be a symbol of fear. Where some people feel like the cross is a symbol of protection, someone else, depending on their experience with the church, might see it as a sign of terror coming from experience. Now, I don't think the cross, it doesn't terrorize me. I can see why people wear it as protection, because it's your state of mind that projects what the cross really means, but I can also see it as a sign of terror because of what the church has done to me. Terrorized me. So let's see. Please stop. The phallus functions as an all-embracing symbol in the Hindu religion, but if a street urchin draws one on a wall, it just reflects an interest in his penis. Because infantile and adolescent fantasies often continue far into adult life, many dreams occur in which there are unmistakable sexual allusions. It would be absurd to understand them as anything else. But when a mason speaks of monks and nuns to be laid upon each other, or an electrician of male plugs and female sockets, it would be ludicrous to suppose that he is indulging in glowing adolescent fantasies. He is simply using colorful descriptive names for his materials. When an educated Hindu talks to you about the lingam, the phallus represents the god Shiva in Hindu mythology, you will hear things we Westerners would never connect with the penis. The lingam is certainly not an obscene allusion, nor is the cross merely a sign of death. Much depends upon the maturity of the dreamer who produces such an image. The interpretation of dreams and symbols demands intelligence. It cannot be turned into a mechanical system and then crammed into unimaginative brains. It demands both an increasing knowledge of the dreamer's individuality and an increasing self-awareness. 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 How many times does that word have to be repeated? And an increasing self-awareness on the part of the interpreter. No experienced worker in this field will deny that there are rules of thumb that can prove helpful, but they must be applied with prudence and intelligence. One may follow all the right rules and yet get bogged down in the most appalling nonsense, simply by overlooking a seemingly unimportant detail that a better intelligence would not have missed. Even a man of high intellect can go badly astray for lack of intuition or feeling. When we attempt to understand symbols, we are not only confronted with the symbol itself, but we are brought up against the wholeness of the symbol-producing individual. This includes the study of his cultural background, and in process, one fills in many gaps in one's own education. This, again, can be applied to a courtroom. I mean, just because you have the education of an attorney or went to school to be a judge because your cultural background and economics allowed you to have such a luxury doesn't mean you know exactly what you're talking about. Making a ruling, not considering the whole picture, like Desmond Tutu says, we have to stop just pulling people out of the river, but go upstream and find out why they're falling in. You can't really make a ruling about a case without figuring out what all the freaking elements of it are. It does more damage than it does good. I know this speaking from personal experience. My son, who had cerebral palsy and was highly intelligent, was killed in a ruling because of a ruling of the court system. And I will never let it go. People with money had the advantage, and it destroyed me and my son and his only sibling and his only sibling's father and a numerous amount of other people by not looking at the entire picture, not just the one sitting in your courtroom in front of your face toting lies, but the picture that happened before we got into the courtroom. Way before my son was even born. It all applies. Okay, that was my little rant. When we attempt to understand symbols, we are not only confronted with the symbol itself, but we are brought up against the wholeness of the symbol-producing individual. This includes the study of his cultural background, and in the process, one fills in many gaps in one's own education. I have made it a rule myself to consider every case as an entirely new proposition about which I do not even know the ABC. Routine responses may be practical and useful while one is dealing with the surface, but as soon as one gets in touch with the vital problems, life itself takes over, and even the most brilliant theoretical premises become ineffectual words. Imagination and intuition are vital in our understanding, and though the usual popular opinion is that they are chiefly valuable to poets and artists, that in sensible matter one should mistrust them. They are in fact equally vital in all the higher grades of science. Here they play an increasingly important role, which supplements that of the rational intellect and its application to a specific problem. Even psychics, the strictest of all applied scientists, even physics, the strictest of all applied sciences, depends to an astonishing degree upon intuition, which works by way of the unconscious. Although it is possible to demonstrate afterward the logical procedures that could have led one to the same result as intuition. Intuition is almost indispensable in the interpretation of symbols, and it can often ensure that they are immediately understood by the dreamer. But while such a lucky hunch may be subjectively convincing, it can also be rather dangerous. It can so easily lead to a false feeling of security. It may, for instance, seduce both the interpreter and the dreamer into continuing a cozy and relatively easy relation, which may end in a sort of mutual dream. The safe basis of real intellectual knowledge and moral understanding gets lost if one is content with the vague satisfaction of having understood by hunch. One can explain and know only if one has reduced intuitions to an exact knowledge of facts and their logical connections. An honest investigator will have to admit that he cannot always do this, but it would be dishonest not to keep it always in mind. Even a scientist is a human being, so it is natural for him, like others, to hate the things he cannot explain. It is a common illusion to believe that what we know today is all we ever can know. Nothing is more vulnerable than scientific theory, which is an ephemeral attempt to explain facts and not an everlasting truth itself. Okay, and then tomorrow I'm going to read the role of symbols. I really like that little segment. Let's see here. I have some, hello, Bradley, Scarlet, hi, green light, a spider of the ceiling. A spider, okay, the ceiling. Anyway, hi everyone. I don't know if I can text back on here. I'll do it later. Okay.